What do you think the experience of flow is like for a person? Because it's called different things, being in the zone, it's got these different terms.
Yeah.
But what is the actual felt experience from your perspective?
Yeah, so it's good that you pointed that out. Terms like runner's high that you were describing a minute ago, being in the zone or in the pocket, musicians talk about, they are all synonyms for this thing. And the scientific term is flow state. So that came from a Hungarian psychologist. His name was Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He was, speaking of chasing happiness, that's what he was interested in. This was where humanistic psychology that Kylie was talking about a few minutes ago was born. This idea that there's more to the study of psychology than the study of what can go wrong in the human mind. They were really interested in the upside of the human experience. And Csikszentmihalyi was really curious about what are the elements of happiness. And he went around the world and asked thousands and thousands of people and ended up coining this term flow state because it's what people describe. So when you're at your best, what are you feeling like? And people would say things like, well, it's like when I'm talking, it just seems like one word is seamlessly flowing into the next. Or if it's an athlete or somebody moving, it's like one movement is just seamlessly flowing into the next. Musicians talk about this. So the word flow was born there. And one of the things he found out was that no matter what kind of flow experience you're having, it's about 8 to 10 characteristics show up. So the lived experience of flow is what he really unpacked for everybody. So it's things like time passing very, very strangely. So we have this altered perception of time, long conversations. You and Kylie had 3 hours, felt like 5 minutes. That's flow. Yeah. So we perceive time differently. We feel a real sense of connection. That can be to an instrument or an object or to another human being. And there's a sense of ease there. There's a sense of calmness about it. There's about 8 or 9 of these kinds of things, but they all are the kind of lived experience of being in flow. And then the really fun stuff for me was when we started looking inside the brains of people when these experiences were showing up and trying to understand what actually is happening underneath the skin when we start to feel this way. And that's been really fun too, because that actually is what leads to these other things. Like when you understand the mechanisms, like what are the things that switch on and switch off inside the brain and the body when these experiences show up, we can figure out other ways to activate those mechanisms. And flow can go from being this fleeting mystical experience to one that you can sort of program for intentionally if you do it properly.
Do we have any like Olympic golfers or experts in snowboarding? No. So I think it would be useful to like bring this back for people and understand how they could apply this. And one of the things I didn't know about prior to interviewing you the first time was MicroFlow States.
Yeah, sure.
And that's more accessible, I think, for the average person who's not a professional golfer.
Yeah.
Would you mind telling us about MicroFlow States?
Sure. Yeah, well, that study that I mentioned, what they did is they used a magnetic coil and they sent a little magnetic pulse into the front of somebody's brain, and it started to shut down their frontal lobes. And this thing that happens to you when you run was happening to them. But here's the interesting thing. I've actually had that done to me, and you feel no different at all. Like you don't feel like you're on a high. You don't feel like, oh, it's the best moment of my life. It's sort of almost imperceptible that anything has happened to you. And yet there, increases in rates of learning from 3 to 5 times, even when it's not really perceptible. So to me, that says like the value proposition for these things called microflow states are really, really powerful because flow is a spectrum of experience. Like every emotional experience we have, you can be really, really happy, or you can be just like kind of in a good mood. You can be really, really mad or just a little bit agitated. Flow is like that too. You can be in these peak moments of your life, birth of your kids, getting married, right? Those are peak life moments. And we call those macro flow states. But then there's all these other things where all the dials of flow maybe get turned down to 3. And, time passes really strangely, or you feel really connected to somebody, but it might not be the best moment of your life. There is still power to be leveraged there, and there's all sorts of great outcomes that you can get in terms of learning, in terms of performance, in terms of just feeling better. Because the definition of flow is an altered state of consciousness where you feel your best and perform your best. We usually talk about the perform piece, but it also is a source of great joy and happiness, and that's, so it's both of those things.
There's also a really great lesson in this, in that for the most part, these flow states don't come by accident, by just walking down the road and then all of a sudden this happens. It's often from people working incredibly hard for a long period of time, improving at their craft or their skill or what they're working on. Then they find these moments. Would you mind walking us through how people get into these states when they're professional golfers, when they're putting in their best? Because I think it's a reminder that we all need to live up to our own potential, whatever that looks like. If you're a great painter, you need to practice painting to get into this state. If you're a great runner, you need to practice running. So would you mind walking us through that?
Well, I think the easiest way to think about this is any kind of flow state generally follows 3 or 4 steps. And the first one is called the struggle phase. There is no flow without struggle. There's an expression that flow follows focus, and focus comes about a lot of times. Like we get really locked into something when there is struggle and we feel agitation in our system. That's where a lot of people quit and stop. But if you can kind of navigate your way through that, there's this release phase, and then flow can show up on the other side of it. But when you go for a run, for example, I'm sure that the first 5 minutes don't feel super flowy. That's the struggle part of the run. But then if you get lucky, you feel that release, and then you can start to feel that runner's high or that flow show up on the back end. It's the same as if you're working, sitting at a desk like I do, writing things. You don't just sit down and have creativity flow out of you. It's always a process of, I overthink, I'm too choosy with my words. But I know that that's when I start to feel kind of agitated by it, I've learned to say, that's the signal. That's what you need to pay attention to. You need to lean in here. And when you do that, you have a chance of sort of breaking through onto the other side where flow can show up. So you have to be willing to lean into the fight.
I agree with you, and I think about it in terms of the interview process, because so many people can think you could just sit up here and ask these types of questions, and I find that there's such an important...
Nobody thinks that. This is a hard job.
Okay. Well, I often think some of the questions that I ask seem like they're simple, but what I try and do is I do a ton of research prior, and then I have kind of the flow of how I want that conversation to go. But then if you or whatever guest comes on and says something interesting, I don't want to be so tied to my notes that I focus more on the next question than I do on hearing and experiencing that answer and kind of having, and that's what, to me, makes great interviewers unique, is they don't stick to a list of questions and then say that they're done. They hone in those specific moments. How do people make sure that they hone in and they experience these benefits when they sort of arise?
Well, I think you've got 2 parts of it here. Number one, you do the work, you prepare. You sort of sharpen your tools, right? Then when you know you have that in your back pocket, that gives you freedom to play. Right? You couldn't just show up here and freestyle, or maybe you could. I think you'd probably be pretty good at it. But I think when we've put in the time and we've put in the work, so you do your version of practice there. It's what athletes do, right? It's put in the time in the gym, working on your skills, so that when the moment shows up, you've got that set of tools, but you can be creative with how you deploy them. That's the really interesting piece, is you don't just go through it one at a time. You're able to kind of move freely, and you have confidence that you know those things are there. But, I think it gives you some freedom to be creative is what you're talking about there.
Do you see health benefits from people who are in these states more regularly than people who are just grinding at the grindstone and just working hard every day and not really having the fun moments?
Well, yes, I think there are. This is not work that I do, but I can tell you that flow is highly correlated through other research that shows that meaning, overall life satisfaction, flow is a massive predictor of those great things. There's some really interesting research that came out after COVID that showed that people who were engaged more frequently in what you would call your primary flow activity, that thing that makes you feel really happy and connected. Could be gardening, it could be racing, it doesn't matter. Whatever you feel those things, when the people who do that more tended to navigate the challenges of COVID at a much higher rate and fended off a lot of the negative outcomes that we saw there. So The mental health benefits are huge. Again, flow is synonymous ultimately with joy and happiness, and the downstream effects of those things are pretty obvious. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Would you mind telling us, you work with people who are professional, like they know what they're doing, but you've also worked with novices. You also work with novices.
Yeah.
We use these terms a lot in society. You're a novice, you're an amateur, you're learning. What are some of the differences between somebody who's a novice and somebody who's an elite professional at what they do in terms of getting into these states?
Well, I'll give you a sort of an academic answer, but I'll try to make it somewhat interesting. There's a stage of learning that we go through. The first one, it's called the cognitive stage, where you're trying to think through everything, right? Learning how to drive a car, you have to learn which pedals do what and which handles do what. We're stuck there for a long time most of the time. Then we start to move through this middle ground where there's a lot of trial and error. We're not having to think too much. But then we get to this place, it's called the autonomous state of learning, where we can use our attention and point it towards the outside world. So you can now drive a car and be watching things around you. And your attentional resources aren't all gobbled up by having to think about which foot does what now and what does this do. So this process of moving away from the thinking brain into the more subconscious elements of movement or performance or whatever it is, it just becomes more, it feels reflexive now. Like you don't think about how you drive a car unless you get in a new car maybe, or a stick shift or something. But most of the time what happens is this gradual movement away from overthinking into the place where you want to turn off the thinking and let the skills just naturally emerge from you. That is not a permanent state, though. Professional athletes struggle too, and the concept of overthinking, those are very real challenges for all of us, and certainly professional athletes too. When we sort of revert back into these more cognitive states where we're thinking about things, trying to use the front of our brain, again, the thing that Kylie talked about that is there to protect us, not to put us into states of high performance, we have to try to think of ways to manage that.